A. Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky was originally serialized in 1866 via a periodical called The Russian Messenger. It was soon collected and sold as a full novel in Russia, with the first English translation being published almost 20 years later. The story follows Raskolnikov, a former law student who's fallen on tough times, living broke and alone in St. Petersburg. He first contemplates, then commits the titular crime. Murder most foul. Now, Raskolnikov has to deal with the fallout, as acquaintances, family members, the police, chronic health concerns, and his own conscience challenge his ability to continue to function in society after he's gotten away with the deed. This novel is a literary classic, and it's highly regarded, especially for the psychological elements in the narrative. However, personally, I appreciate Crime and Punishment for its sense of place. The depiction of mid-19th century St. Petersburg is gritty. The city itself has a distinct character of sweaty squalor. It is dirty and poor and run down. The interior spaces are all too small and hot and claustrophobic, creating these pressurized containers where all the dialogue and psychological elements can take shape. The first section of the book, up to and immediately after the murder, is actually quite good. It's page-turning stuff. And the chapters that deal with Raskolnikov are usually quite interesting, but those that deviate too far away from him can be a bit of a grind, as few of the other characters are as compelling as he is. Like so many Victorian-era novels that were originally published in the serialized format, there is a plodding, stretched-out quality to the overall story in Crime and Punishment, but its literary status can't be ignored. It is full of iconic imagery, and its philosophical and psychological depth continues to draw new readers to it to this day. This is one of those novels that I procrastinated on getting around to for a long while. For years, I'd pick up the odd copy whenever I stumbled upon it at a used bookshop, and consequently I have quite a collection of various English translations. This is the Constance Garner translation, the Michael Scammell translation, great cover art on that one, the David Megershak translation, and this one's by Jesse Coulson. Eventually I settled on this David McDuff translation, because it's modern and well regarded, and at this point in my reading life, I just prefer the trade format to pocketbook editions. The cover features a painting of a Russian student who looks a lot like Dostoevsky's description of Raskolnikov, with a chronology of the author's life at the beginning, followed by an introduction from the translator. In these 23 pages, McDuff goes through the initial response to Crime and Punishment upon its original serialized publication, then considers a number of subsequent critical perspectives from the many decades since then. This intro features many lengthy quotes from both the critical material and the novel itself, and should only be read after you've read the novel in its entirety. Then there's a list of suggested further reading, a note on the translation, and a note on money. For the book proper, each of the novel's 6 parts has a plain title page, and each new chapter starts right after the previous one ends. At the back, there are 15 pages of notes from McDuff that help with the historical context. When I learned that the Folio Society version of this novel also happened to be the McDuff translation, I decided to give it a look to see what else it had to offer as an upgrade. So let's do this. Here we have Crime and Punishment from the Folio Society. This version was released in 1997. It's presented in a plain dark green paper-covered slipcase. The binding features 2 images that also appear on the interior. On the front, we have Raskolnikov pulling an axe from his coat, while on the back he is depicted with a shaved head and he's in chains. We've got the crime and the punishment right on the covers. It's quarter-bound in deep red cloth, and while the front and back boards may come across as paper-covered on camera, they're actually cloth-covered, which is great. On the spine, we see the title in large gold foil, with a small design and the publisher's name below that. The binding for the book is appropriately finished with white and red bands. When we open the novel, we're met by speckled end papers and a paper stock that isn't much thicker than the ibis white wove paper that's used for the text block itself. This paper has a slight bit of tooth to it, and comes in at a white with some earthy gray undertones, at least according to these color swatches. In this edition, each of the novel's 6 parts starts on a fresh page and is signaled by this large text font, while each new chapter begins immediately after the last and is signaled with a Roman numeral in a set of braces. If we bring back the Penguin Classics edition for a brief side-by-side, we can see that the Folio Society version is much bigger, with an extra 4 centimeters in the height and 3 centimeters in the width. The font size is the same in the Folio version, but there are more lines per page. The typeface on the Folio edition may be a touch more cramped, but the generous margins are appreciated and help the reading experience here. The introduction is by Sir Stephen Tumim, who was a judge and Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons. He begins by confessing that he came to Crime and Punishment much later in life, which I can relate to, and he explains his hesitation with reading the book in his youth. He continues in these 5 pages by comparing the Russian novel to the major English books at the same time, then goes on to compare the Russian notion of justice described in the book to the English justice system that he understands so well. This makes for an interesting and unique take in the intro, though it should be noted that Tumim's introduction does feature spoilers and should not be read before reading Crime and Punishment for the first time. This solid little introduction was written in 1997, 6 years before Tumim's death. The interior artwork, like the cover, is by Harry Brockway. Brockway, who recently passed away, was a prolific wood and stone carver. He illustrated many books for the Folio Society, including Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, Frankenstein, and the Magritte books. Mr. Brockway typically worked in wood engravings for his book illustration. The artwork here is presented on the same paper stock as the text block, and they all land right next to the text they coincide with, which is something I really appreciate when it comes to the design of an illustrated novel. Let's take a detailed look at that artwork now. The first illustration, the frontispiece, is a portrait of author Fyodor Dostoevsky, and it establishes the expectations for the amazing engravings we're going to encounter throughout this book. They will all be presented in this elongated vertical shape with sharp corners at the bottom and rounded corners at the top. The purest blacks are used around the eyes, nose, and mouth to draw attention to these features, but it's the incredible and often subtle textures that Brockway achieves that really impress me. The skin looks almost reptilian or like the bark of a tree, and the background gradient is wonderful, but the shading on the coat jacket is unbelievable. I marvel at the number of values the artist was able to produce here, from the highlights on the shoulder to the shadow of the collar. It's incredible. The second illustration is a portrait of Simeon Marmeladov, a destitute civil servant that the protagonist, Raskolnikov, meets in a bar. Marmeladov sits behind his jug of vodka, with his head in his hands, clothes that don't fit, and he shares the story of his misfortune and his foolishness. These white wisps are a wonderful detail, as the alcoholic admits to having slept in the hay barges of St. Petersburg for the past 5 nights. The third image depicts Alyona and Lizaveta Ivanovna, and has strong elements of characterization. Alyona is the elder sister, a wealthy pawnbroker who's said to be horrible, cruel, and repulsive. That is all conveyed in her face, and in her hands she seems to clutch a pledge. Her half-sister, Lizaveta, is apparently mistreated by Alyona and must do all the cooking and cleaning. Lizaveta is at least 6 feet tall, awkward, and is described like a soldier dressed up, but is still attractive and is apparently always pregnant. In the artwork, her quiet and mild countenance is present as she clutches her stomach. The fourth image is the same piece used on the cover, a depiction of Raskolnikov pulling the axe from his coat. The text describes that he's barely conscious and operates almost without effort, almost mechanically, and this is all conveyed in his demeanor here. Check out the tensed neck muscles and the value control on his coat, as well as more wonderful texture work for the background. The next illustration is a depiction of Razumikin, Raskolnikov's only real acquaintance from his days as a student. Razumikin's poverty may be even greater than the protagonist's, though they haven't seen each other in 4 months. He is wearing a dressing gown worn to rags and slippers, looking unshaven and unwashed. He's in the midst of translating texts and is concerned for his friend. There are some great details on the layers of clothing, and he plays a large role in the later parts of the novel as he helps Raskolnikov get through an intense bout of fever. The sixth image is of Pyotr Petrovich Luzin, who appears in Raskolnikov's doorway, fresh from the tailor and barber. His hair's all curled, his outfit is crisp, and he holds his hat and gloves like they've never been used. He can no longer be described as young, and his imposing standoffish air is evident in his posture and countenance here. Again, there's more great texture work in this image, from the clothing to the background. The seventh piece is of Raskolnikov's mother and sister, who come to visit him in St. Petersburg. Pulcheria Alexandrinova is in a simple dress with an amazingly well-rendered lace collar, while her daughter, Dunya, stands behind her with a firm expression. I'm not wild about the placement and the proportion of the arms here. This is one illustration that feels a touch wooden or uninteresting to me, especially when it comes to the bottom two-thirds. The next image is more like it. It depicts Porfiry Petrovich. The lead investigator in a murder case is at home and is sporting a dressing gown. He's clean and shaven and well-fed, with a round head, a snub nose, and a quizzical look. He's a shrewd and intelligent mind who likes to express the flaws in the logic of others and who regularly challenges Raskolnikov. For a portrait, there's a surprising amount of movement to this piece, with the lines of his face and neck, the chair back, and the clothing, but I keep coming back to this almost caricature look, which somehow perfectly captures Porfiry's mocking, smarmy expression. This is one of the best. The next piece is the first that isn't really a character portrait, but is an illustration of a particular scene. This older, mysterious fellow, who Raskolnikov calls an artisan, was asking about the student back at his lodging. Raskolnikov follows the man through the streets of St. Petersburg to find out why, and the older fellow sets him with a menacing look and quietly accuses him of being a murderer. There are some lovely St. Petersburg buildings in the background, the brick wall and the streets in the foreground, and Raskolnikov clutches his hands behind him in tension. The 10th piece is another character portrait, this time of Sonia Marmeladova. Raskolnikov asks the young woman to read to him from the Bible the story of Lazarus. Sonia is hesitant at first, her hand shakes and her voice falters, but she masters herself and reads the gospel forcefully and raises her eyes to her quiet listener. This portrait is especially beautiful. The strength and the intensity in Sonia is evident, and the value work for her cheekbones is exceptional. But all the texture work around her is also great. Check out these cell shapes along her arms and in the corners. I'm not sure how much of this is due to the artist and how much of it is due to the materials he's working with, but there's something that makes these wood carvings really interesting to explore and appreciate. My eye lingers on them longer than it would for a normal drawing. Here we have another portrait, this time of the widow, Katerina Marmeladova. It looks like something out of a horror story. In their apartment, right after her husband's funeral, the widow stands in the center. She is unwell, as we can see from the spots on her face, and her thin frame is emphasized by her dark dress, which reminds me of something out of a Tim Burton film down the front, and which culminates in her gnarled hands. To add to the unsettling tone, her children creepily peer out from around her in the sheet that hangs in their lodging. The 12th illustration is another particularly striking piece. It's of Raskolnikov at the beginning of part 6, when he's overcome by solitude and depression. He holds his head in his hands as he tries to sort through his confused thoughts. And in his eyes we see some of the apathy that is described later in these passages. The wood-grain texture on his face and the chaotic line work on his hand, and below that for his clothing, help emphasize the tone of despair that is perfectly captured here. The penultimate illustration is a portrait of Svidrigailov. He sits at a table in a hotel room. His uneaten plate of veal is attracting flies, his arms are crossed, and he has a completely apathetic look on his face. The details of his jacket and overcoat are fantastic, including these wrinkles on his shoulder, and the dark textured background helps emphasize the figure with a high degree of contrast. The final image is of Raskolnikov from his time in Siberia, from the novel's epilogue. He's just gotten over an illness, his head is bald, and he's in chains. We see the same elements at play here that have been present throughout this collection of engravings. The textured background, the lighting effects, the work with value around the wrinkles and creases of the clothing, but I think the choice to have half of Raskolnikov's prison garb in the light and half in the dark is quite appropriate here, given the ultimate conclusion of the narrative. This image is already familiar to us from the earlier look at the back cover. It's worth noting that there is no back matter provided in this version of the novel, unlike the paperback edition, which featured contextual notes. I like this edition of Crime and Punishment. The novel itself is not my favorite literary classic, but I really do appreciate the build, binding, and design of the book here. The artwork is especially interesting. Woodblock engravings make for such compelling and impressive black and white artwork. In terms of how Crime and Punishment matches up with the other Dostoevsky releases from Folio, as of right now, it's a bit of a broken situation for those who need everything to match. This first edition of Crime and Punishment aligns with their release of the Brothers Karamazov in terms of the spine and the end papers, but their edition of the short stories, which is still currently available on their website, actually matches the second print of Crime and Punishment, where they refreshed the design and went with deep red end papers. Hopefully I can someday have a set of the 3 in series. Until then, I guess I need to hold on to both printings because I have problems. But when it comes to all these cheap paperback copies of Crime and Punishment that I've accumulated over the years, I'm just happy to move them all to the Box of Doom, because now I have this copy, and also this copy, to take their place on my bookshelf. As always, thanks for watching, and keep an eye out for future videos. When it comes to the stories you love, it's always worth upgrading your books.